Mesdames et messieurs, nous sommes très heureux de vous accueillir chez nous à l'Institut Macdonald-Laurier pour ce dîner-conférence au sujet de l'ingérence potentielle de la Russie dans le déroulement de nos élections fédérales prévues pour le mois d'octobre. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Brian Lee Crowley. I'm Managing Director of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. We welcome you to this event today. It's a special panel event that will explore the theme of Russia-proofing your election, defending against cyber threats and disinformation. Thank you very much for coming and being with us. As you might know, Russia has unleashed all-out information warfare against the democracies of the West, a television and digital onslaught on the liberal democratic values and institutions, not just of Canada, but of all Western societies. What is the aim of these attacks? Nothing less than breaking the political, economic, and military framework of European and North Atlantic cooperation. When NATO and the European Union lose public support, cooperation breaks down and national interests take over. In a fragmented European and North Atlantic community, Russia gains power and influence. If you cannot make yourself strong, make your opponents weak. That is Russia's strategy now. Elections provide a particularly fertile ground for Russia to damage Western democracies. We've seen attempts to meddle in recent elections prominently in the US, but also in the Baltic countries, well represented with us here today, by the way, France and elsewhere in Europe. Other countries that are in some kind of an adversarial relationship to the West, such as Iran and China, have similar goals and employ similar methods. Canada is not immune to this danger. And our federal election is rapidly approaching in October. We need to be better prepared to combat foreign meddling in our democratic processes, to Russia-proof our elections, so to speak. To understand best practices in defending the integrity of Western elections from disinformation and cyber campaigns, MLI has brought together a panel of key experts to answer your questions about these issues. To begin this event, I'm delighted that Arif Virani, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Democratic Institutions and the Minister of Justice, and a fellow alum with me from the Parliamentary Internship Program, saw him at the 50th anniversary celebrations just a few weeks ago, that Arif has taken time out of his busy schedule to join us today to explain the Canadian government's plans. And Arif is a former Ugandan Asian refugee, has spent the past 14 years as a constitutional litigator, advocating for human rights and access to justice. He's worked as an assistant trial attorney prosecuting genocide at the United Nations International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. And I would ask you to join me in welcoming Arif Virani to the MLI platform.
Well, I'd forgotten about that connection with the Parliamentary Internship Program, so thank you for reminding me about that, Brian. Thank you for having me. Thank you and good afternoon. And I want to acknowledge, first of all, that we're on traditionally Indigenous territory, the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples. I want to thank the organizers of the event for having me here, David and Allison and everyone at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute for their hard work in putting together today's event, and also the impressive group of panelists. I was just sharing some discussions about the forthcoming election with Alan Rock, who previously was in a person like mine's shoes in terms of getting ready for upcoming elections. And we had some interesting discussions, and I'm sure there'll be many more to come. But it's an honor to be sharing the stage with you, Mr. Rock, with Liz, with Jakub Handa, and to my friend Marcus Kolga, who has been a... It's hard to describe Marcus, and I'll try to do it justice, but I'm not sure if there is a more staunch advocate for accountability and transparency and in the fight against disinformation, particularly with respect to Russia, than Mr. Kolga. And he has been doing that for such a long time, and he is a voice of reason and a voice of considered expertise in this area. And we thank you for that. So when he tells me to come or jump, I say, how high, Marcus? Because I've learned quite quickly. And je vais ajouter... Je vais ajouter quelques petits mots en français juste au début, mais bien sûr, je suis tout à fait à l'aise comme député fédéral en français, donc je vais faire des petits commentaires de temps en temps en français aussi. So thank you for having me here today. So I'm here to sort of pitch you on the government's plan. And yes, there's an election, and yes, my voice is a bit hoarse, and unfortunately it's not because I was door knocking so hard yesterday. I was sort of screaming at a scream about the Raptors and their 1 point loss yesterday. But I'm sure there are many that are hoarse like me in the room because it's truly become Canada's team, and Canada's behind that team, including some of our American guests from Texas who are also cheering the Canada's team. So thank you for that. But elections, I mean, this is not news to the people gathered in this room. Elections are an opportunity for Canadians to be heard, right? They're an opportunity to express opinions on the most fundamental aspect of their expressive rights, which is casting their vote in terms of selecting their elected leaders. The 43rd election is coming soon. It's coming on October 21st in particular. And what we've seen, as Brian was mentioning, is that democracies around the world have entered clearly what is a new era. It's an era of a heightened dynamic threat that necessitates intensified vigilance by governments, but also by all members of society, including the members in this room, but your neighbors, your friends, the people that live down your street. Each election is unique. We know that, I know that. I've not been doing this for multiple terms, but you hear that over and over again. 2015 is not like what 2019 will be, nor was 2015 like 2011, et cetera, et cetera. What we know in terms of empirically is that evidence has confirmed that in 2015, that election did not experience any incidents of sophisticated or concerted interference, but we cannot predict what will happen this fall, and we must, most of all, be prepared for anything to happen this fall. So recently, the minister I'm privileged to work with is Karina Gould. She apologizes for not being here with you today, but in her capacity as Minister of Democratic Institutions, along with the Minister of National Defense, they announced recently the release of the 2019 update to the Communications Security Establishments Report, so the CSE report entitled Cyber Threats to Canada's Democratic Process. That report update highlights that it is very likely that Canadians, in fact, will encounter some form of foreign cyber interference. And of course, Marcus is shaking his head because it's people like Marcus that help us inform that kind of report. And the CSC report underlines that it is unlikely that the interference will be on the scale of what we saw with Russian activity in the 2016 US presidential election, it does note that in 2018, half of all of the advanced democracies holding national elections, so literally half around the planet, representing a threefold increase since 2015, had their democratic processes targeted by cyber threat activity. And that Canada, indeed this country, this peaceful, orderly country that we know and love, is also at risk. And this upward trend is likely to continue in 2019. So that trend has seen the tools that we use to strengthen civic engagement co-opted to undermine, disrupt, and destabilize democracy. Social media, in particular, has been misused to spread false and misleading information. You know, it's funny chatting with Alan just prior to starting, and the landscape was very different. When I was an intern, I worked with a woman named Patty Torsey on the Justice Committee when Mr. Rock was the Minister of Justice, and there weren't people walking around asking for selfies with the Minister of Justice because those devices didn't exist and those platforms didn't exist. The world has changed really quite fundamentally, and what we're struggling to do, in all candor, is keep up with that change because it is so dynamic and so evolving at such a rapid pace. But what we understand is that social media is being misused to spread false and misleading information. And I could have an entirely separate discussion with people like the folks here from B'nai B'rith about online hatred, the spread of hatred online. That is just another aspect of what we're seeing in terms of the social media domain. Ces dernières années, nous avons vu des acteurs étrangers chercher à compromettre les sociétés et institutions démocratiques, les processus électoraux, la souveraineté et la sécurité. Ces tactiques malveillantes, multiformes et en constante évolution constituent une menace stratégique grave. Nous devons nous y préparer. These malicious, multifaceted, and ever-evolving tactics constitute clearly a serious strategic threat, and we must be prepared for this. The CSC's 2017 and the most recent 2019 assessments, along with ongoing Canadian intelligence, as well as the experiences of allies and like-minded jurisdictions around the world, have informed and guided our efforts over the past year. And they've led to the development of a plan of action that are based on 4 pillars. So I want to talk to you about those 4 pillars now. What we're doing is, in addition to reinforcing and protecting government infrastructure, systems, and practices, we're also focusing on heavily on preparing Canadians working with digital platforms that have an important role in fostering positive democratic debate and dialogue. So there are 4 pillars. So the first is enhancing citizen preparedness. The second is improving organizational readiness. The third is combating foreign interference, germane to what we're discussing today particularly. And the fourth is with respect to the expectations on social media platforms. So when we announced the plan, it was back in January 30th. It's Minister Gould, Minister Goodale, Public Safety and Security, and Minister Sajjan, Minister of Defense. And it may seem a bit puzzling why you'd put all 3 of those together, but it shows you the clarity with which we're looking at this as a whole of government approach, and the fact that this is actually a defense and security threat when we're talking about electoral interference. So on citizen preparedness, we announced $7 million to investing in resilience. Now, I'm looking at the crowd, and I don't want to pass too much judgment about relative ages, but it looks like there's a few people in the crowd that are a bit older than me. We know that some people's facility with social media platforms tends to vary, right? We hear the stories about people of different generations and what they're engaging with, how they're trying to figure out how to use Twitter and Facebook, et cetera. But the most fundamental thing we're trying to teach Canadians across every age demographic, across every cultural demographic, is to be critical and think hard about what you are seeing, what you are reading, and in particular what you are sharing, because that is how false news and fake news tends to be spread. And that's what that $7 million is targeted towards. It's towards addressing misleading and inflammatory disinformation published online and through social media, and equipping citizens with the tools and skills they need to critically assess what they are seeing online. There are things that we can share online that we would never share if they were on the front page of a newspaper or in a magazine, and yet we're quick to do it because we think that's just sort of what is done. We need to think critically about our own actions, and what we're trying to do is leverage the expertise of civil society organizations in supporting those types of citizen-focused activities, including civic literacy programming and tools. We're also leveraging a program called Get Cyber Safe, and that's a national public awareness campaign to educate Canadians about cybersecurity and the simple steps they can take to protect themselves online. A very interesting aspect that we've rolled out is something that we call the Critical Election Incident Public Protocol. That's a big mouthful. I'm just going to call it the protocol, and I'll explain to you what it is. It's a nonpartisan, simple, and clear method for informing Canadians if a serious incident arises during the writ period that might threaten the integrity of the 2019 general election. So what am I talking about? So think about the stances and the positions that had to be taken during the 2016 American presidential election. Threats were identified, people were feeling the need to come forward, then people were questioning the authority and the biases or not, the objectivity or subjectivity of the people that came forward. What we were trying to do is avoid that scenario entirely. You can imagine what it might be like if the Prime Minister stood up during the middle of the writ period when he is a candidate in the riding of Papineau and raised his hand and said, "We believe we've had interference from this foreign state or this foreign actor." That would be immediately questioned, and probably rightfully so. What we're trying to do is immunize political candidates from making those determinations. So what have we done? We've created this protocol. It puts the decision to inform Canadians directly in the hands of 5 of Canada's most experienced senior public servants. Who are those people? The Clerk of the Privy Council of Canada, the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Deputy Minister of Justice, the Deputy Minister of Public Safety, and the National Security and Intelligence Advisor. That group of 5 people works on a consensus model. They are the ones that have the responsibility to ensure the effective, peaceful transition of power and the continuity of government through election periods. This is something that Alan Rock would be familiar with, and those of you in the room, during that caretaker period when a writ has been dropped and a campaign is in full swing. The public service has played that role for generations. It will continue to fill that important role in the upcoming election and beyond. So the protocol with these 5 individuals would be initiated to respond to incidents that occur within the writ period that do not fall within Elections Canada's area of responsibility for the proper administration of the election. The threshold for informing the public will be very high and limited to addressing exceptional circumstances that could impair our ability to have a free and fair election. And that's got to be right if you think about it. We don't want minor incidents in a particular riding in one remote part of the country to trigger a national press conference involving these 5 individuals. But what they're expected to do is assess it based on its gravity and its significance, come to a decision jointly based on consensus. It's not one person deciding what Canadians should know during the middle of an election. And we've consulted with political parties across the spectrum in Parliament on the development of this very protocol. Partisanship has rightly been put aside in the interests of fairness. Incorporating input from all parties has allowed a fair process that all Canadians should be able to trust. Now I'm going to talk about the second. Donc, dans le cadre du deuxième pilier, renforcer la préparation organisationnelle, l'une des nouvelles initiatives clés consiste à s'assurer que les partis politiques qui sont tous conscients de la nature de la menace afin qu'ils puissent prendre les mesures nécessaires pour améliorer leurs pratiques et comportements en matière de sécurité interne. Le CSD a affirmé dans son rapport en 2017, ainsi que dans sa mise à jour en 2019, que les partis politiques constituent toujours l'un des maillons faibles du système canadien. Voilà pourquoi les organismes de sécurité nationale offriront des séances de l'information sur les menaces aux dirigeants des partis politiques. So we understand that one of the weakest links in this whole equation are actually political parties themselves. So what we are doing is offering services and training from security agencies to help prepare every political party for such a threat occurring. The third pillar is combating foreign interference. We've established the Security and Intelligence Threats to Elections Task Force. Again, a big moniker, I apologize. We call it SITE, S-I-T-E, to improve awareness of foreign threats and support assessment and response. The team brings together the CSE, CSIS, the RCMP, and Global Affairs Canada to ensure a comprehensive understanding of and response to any threats to Canada. SITE has been building a baseline of threat awareness and has been meeting with international partners to make sure that Canada can effectively assess and mitigate any malicious interference activity. Where national security heads believe that an incident could pose a threat to the integrity of Canada's upcoming federal election, they coordinate with the National Security and Intelligence Advisor to brief the panel of senior public service officials that I mentioned, that panel of members who constitute the protocol, who will then determine whether the incident meets the threshold of interfering with Canada's ability to have a free and fair election. And they will decide whether Canadians must be informed. They will hold the press conference and they will make the announcements. As well, as announced at the G7 Charlevoix Summit last year in June of 2018, we've also contributing to a G7 rapid response mechanism, which is an initiative to strengthen the coordination across the G7 in identifying, preventing, and responding to threats to G7 democracies. That's housed within Global Affairs Canada, and it's an RRM, or rapid response mechanism, that will act as a focal point for us and for all of our other partners within the G7. It will produce analysis and reports on threat patterns and trends. The information shared across the G7 will be used to develop a better understanding of the evolving threat environment. The last pillar, the fourth pillar, social media platforms. The transformation of the media landscape impacts the whole of society in very tangible ways. All of us in this room know this. Social media and online platforms are effectively the new arbiters of information, and therefore we firmly believe they have a responsibility to manage their platforms and the communities that are involved in their platforms. We know that they've been manipulated to spread disinformation, create confusion, and exploit societal tension. These platforms have themselves acknowledged the risk posed by misinformation and by disinformation. Minister Gould has been meeting with social media and digital platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, Google, and Microsoft, to secure action to increase transparency, improve authenticity, and to ensure greater integrity on their platforms. Those discussions are progressing slowly and have not yet yielded the results we expect. And we're being candid about that. These are large behemoths that have GDPs, that have balance sheets that are larger than the GDPs of many nations on this earth. Right? Who's kidding who? We had a situation where Mark Zuckerberg has failed to appear before a committee in England. That committee then came to Canada. He failed to appear here. We are having issues with holding these platforms accountable. We recognize that, but as Minister Gould has also said, the era of self-regulation is clearly coming to an end, and we need to take action to deal with these platforms, and that is what we are intending to do. We remain steadfast in that commitment to secure change from those platforms based on this. Le gouvernement est d'avis que la protection des processus et des institutions démocratiques du Canada est une priorité centrale. Voilà pourquoi, en plus des mesures que je viens de décrire, nous avons promis une somme importante de nouveaux fonds pour soutenir ces efforts. Le budget de 2019 prévoit 48 millions de dollars supplémentaires à l'appui des efforts pan-gouvernementaux. So what I'm talking about is the most recent budget allocation, what we've put in to actually secure funding to address these security threats. It's $48 million to support a whole of government effort. That is directed towards the Department of Canadian Heritage to undertake much-needed research regarding the spread of disinformation online. It is targeted towards investments at Global Affairs to deepen our engagement with G7 allies. It is directed towards funding the Communications Security Establishment, CSE, to enable them to support the Canadian political parties and election administrators in improving their cybersecurity. And it also means investments in CSIS to allow them to better combat foreign interference. This comprehensive plan is also bolstered by recent legislative efforts. So before closing, I just want to highlight a couple of aspects of Bill C-76 that touch on what we're talking about here, about making an election more accessible, transparent, and secure. And all of this should be understood under the rubric of the fact that we have a strong Elections Canada, a strong Commissioner of Elections, who have been also enhanced in their powers pursuant to our most recent legislative changes, and the fact that we have a paper ballot system renders us inherently more secure than systems or democracies around the planet that vote electronically. So recognize that as a preambulatory comment. But what we need to understand with Bill C-76 is that that bill got royal assent last December, and it takes important steps to counter foreign interference and threats posed by emerging technologies. There are many provisions in the bill. I'll only highlight a few. Prohibiting foreign entities from spending any money to influence elections. Where previously they were allowed to spend up to $500, we've eliminated that entirely under Bill C-76. We now require organizations selling advertising space to not knowingly accept elections advertisements from foreign entities. And the third piece I want to leave you with is that we've added a prohibition regarding the, quote, unauthorized use of computers, which is drawn from pre-existing aspects of the criminal code, where there's an intent to obstruct, interrupt, or interfere with the lawful use of computer data during an election period. Le Canada dispose d'un organisme d'administration des élections solide et renommé mondial, soit Élections Canada. Je crois que cela, conjugué aux efforts en matière de loi, des politiques et des programmes que je vous ai décrits en détail aujourd'hui, place le Canada dans la meilleure position possible pour contrer tout effort d'ingérence dans le processus démocratique. So it is impossible to fully predict what kinds of threats we will see in the run-up to and during this fall's election. But I want to assure you, and I want to assure your neighbors and other Canadians, that we as a government have a solid plan in place, and we will continue to test and probe our readiness to take whatever steps are needed to secure a free, fair, and fair election in 2018. On that note, it's been a long spiel. I apologize, but I thought that was important information to impart. Thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to the panel discussion. Merci beaucoup.
Stay right there. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Arif Virani has kindly agreed, since I believe he can stay until 1:30.
1:30.
To join the panel, which Marcus is going to moderate in a few minutes. But before we do that, I thought I'd take a few minutes and take maybe 2 or 3 questions, no more, from the floor for Mr. Virani based on his remarks, because we may not have enough time to get questions to you at the end of the panel discussion for leaving at 1:30. So, first hand up, right here.
I'm glad you watched the basketball game last night. You probably noticed the political ads, several of them, and I think they would actually fall under some of the rules that you're putting forward, because I think there was a very high level of disinformation in virtually all of them. So I'll hand that over to you. I don't know whether that interference is you only act if it's foreign interference or happening inside Canada. I think if Russia was listening to that, they'd say, wow, boy, this Canadian's pretty good at it.
So duly noted, and there were a few ads that took place during the game yesterday. And what I can tell you is that what we've done is we've implemented rules. There have always been rules during an election period. We've also implemented rules under Bill C-76 and the amendments to the Elections Act to cover what's called the pre-writ period. However, the pre-writ period as defined in the legislation counts from June 30th onwards. So prior to June 30th, we are in sort of a situation where there aren't hard and fast rules about the types of ads or about the spending that's occurring on the ads in particular. So there are specific spending limits on ads and the requirements to maintain registries about ads on online platforms. But the spending allocation doesn't apply now, so that's why you've seen, for example, in Ontario, a flurry of ads that are being undertaken sometimes by official federal parties, sometimes by other actors. But those accountability mechanisms, and particularly the spending limits, don't get triggered until June 30th. And you're going to say, well, why June 30th? Well, we tried to establish a situation where we tried to come up with, as best we could, a line in the sand that reflected sort of the summertime period, which is usually used as a de facto campaign, and ensured that the accountability that we would hold people to during the proper campaign extends to that pre-campaign period, namely the summer.
Another question here. Just wait for the microphone to go on.
A pathogen or a virus is ineffective against a healthy body. If we had true citizens in a country, we would not be suffering from this kind of malaise about Russians and Ukrainians. And I define for you what a citizen is one who willingly takes the stand to be totally responsible for everyone and everything that goes on in this community. That's what citizenship is. When I hear politicians bad-mouthing each other, I don't think they're acting like good citizens. They're not a good role model for us.
Right.
So let's clean up our house first of all, before we start to pass the buck on to China or Russia or other people that get in our business. Thank you.
Although perhaps we can walk and chew gum at the same time.
So, fair comment, sir. I'll tell you that the most illuminating illustration of what I have about how Canadians react to the partisanship that they see just several blocks from here is when young people come and they visit the gallery. And they say, well, our teacher wouldn't let us act like that in grade 6. Why is that kind of behavior being tolerated? And there is too much negativity. This is my first term. I came from the courtroom environment. I find the decorum sometimes woefully lacking. And I think it's very, very unfortunate. I will confess to being part of a team, and there's a team component that makes politics a bit of a competitive sort of combat sport sometimes. And it's hard to divorce yourself from that and act with that parliamentary decorum at all times. But it's reminders like that that are important, because we need to look inward towards how our constituents would view our behavior before we're thinking about potential interference from foreign actors about what they may try and do to influence those constituents. So I hear you 1,000%, but it's an important reminder that I think needs to be spread across all party lines. And I'll confess to you that in a speech about the standing orders, early on in my parliamentary career, we have this ability to say what we would change. And one of the things I think we do is we mug too much for those cameras. There's one just over your head. And you could either implement cameras everywhere so that they could see every person who's heckling or reading the newspaper or not being polite and parliamentarian, or you could remove cameras altogether and hopefully have more rigorous debate. And people would stop mugging for the cameras for those soundbite opportunities, and that would help to improve the decorum and reduce some of that partisanship. And thank you, that's an important reminder.
Yes, I long thought that cameras in Parliament were not an improvement. Third question, and then we'll go to our panel.
Thank you. It seems we're taking very much tactical, defensive approach to dealing with foreign election interference, where, with the possible exception of computer security, as you mentioned in one of the pillars, we're waiting for an attack on us. We're waiting for somebody to try and interfere, and then we're trying to figure out how we're going to react to them, what we're going to do. I would suggest if we're going to be successful, we have to take more operational, a more preparatory approach. We have to prepare our citizens, much in the same way Finland's had some success, Ukraine is trying to do now with its students, so people understand what's happening when they see election interference, so they understand the mechanisms behind it, that we're not doing nearly enough of that. The next element is a strategic approach, which is an offensive approach. Now, we can't do what Putin and the Kremlin is doing. It'll be against our values. But how do we use our values to attack those that are attacking us? It's a very difficult problem in a free society, but we have to figure out a way of doing it, because all we're going to be doing, if we're defensive all the time, is backing up against the wall, backing up farther, backing up farther.
And I think that's an important point, but I concur wholeheartedly with what you said towards the end. It's really trying to find that magic balance, because what I didn't say in my comments, and should have been stated, is that these platforms have also enabled an incredible amount of democratic participation, not just in this country, but around the planet. Like, I think most directly of the Arab Spring uprisings in North Africa, where people are communicating in ways that they were never able to, and in effect, sort of holding to account unelected leaders or people that were fairly despotic in terms of their regimes. There are Ukrainians in the room that know about the Maidan and how that was informed through things like Facebook, et cetera. Their examples are replete, but it's in trying to find that balance. What we're trying to do as best as possible is allow for that freedom of expression to take place. It used to be, on a soapbox in Hyde Park in Britain. It transformed to Maclean's Magazine and the Toronto Star and the Globe and Mail, and now it's on computers, and that's a good thing generally if it allows people to engage. But if it's used for malevolent purposes, that's when we have to step in. And the key is trying to stay on top of how those uses could occur and how quickly we can respond. It is reactive thus far, but I appreciate what you're saying, and I think the proactive component is about that citizen resilience that we're investing in. A strong argument can be made that we need much more than $7 million planted on that side of the ledger to ensure that all of us are more critical about what we are viewing, how we are interpreting it, and how quickly we are sharing it.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I know there are other questions, but I said I'd only take 2 or 3 right now. Then we're going to move to the panel, and there will be another question period at the end of the panel, so it's not that we're shutting off the questions, but I think we need to keep moving. Before I ask Marcus to come up, I'll just say that I used to think that nothing good ever came out of the monstrous regime of Idi Amin in Uganda. But I have to revise my thought on that. The people that we have received, of whom Arif Virani is a wonderful example, have enriched Canada beyond measure, and we're very lucky to have them. Right? Now let me introduce Marcus Kolga, who's already had a bit of an introduction because Arif made some very appropriate comments about the contribution that Marcus has made to democratic debate in Canada, and I'm delighted to say that partly in his role as a senior fellow at MLI, he was instrumental in seeing Magnitsky legislation adopted in Canada. Marcus is a senior fellow at the Institute. He's an international award-winning documentary filmmaker. He's a journalist. He's a digital communication strategist and a leading Canadian expert on Russian and Central and Eastern European issues. He's the co-founder and publisher of upnorth.eu, an online magazine that features analysis and political and cultural news from the Nordic and Baltic region. In 2015, Marcus was awarded the Estonian Order of the White Star by President Toomas Hendrik Ilves, and in 2017, he was also awarded the Magnitsky Award for outstanding contribution to the global Magnitsky campaign that I just mentioned. We are honored and enriched at MLI to have Marcus as one of our senior fellows. Marcus.
Well, I'd invite our panelists to come on up and take a seat. Thank you, Brian, for those kind words, and Arif for those embarrassingly kind words that you had earlier. I want to thank Arif because he, since being elected in 2015, he's really been extremely supportive of all of these Central and Eastern European issues of disinformation, was really instrumental in seeing our Magnitsky legislation get passed here. So thank you, Arif, for all that and all the support for all these issues. I'd like to thank MLI, Brian, David and David, Shuvaloy, Brett, Irfan, Allison, and Amber for organizing today's event and for your ongoing leadership in exposing the threat of Kremlin and other foreign disinformation targeting Canadian democracy and our upcoming elections. Identifying and exposing Russian disinformation is often a lonely business, where those engaged in it are often vulnerable to trolling, attacks on their credibility, and occasion, as you all know, much, much worse. Without the support of MLI and other like-minded organizations who bring together and support the work of researchers and activists like those who are here with us today, these malign regimes would have the upper hand. Thank you to MLI and our panelists for bravely advancing our understanding of this very serious problem and for actively participating as part of the solution. Many of us have been warning about the Kremlin's intensifying information warfare against the West for the past decade. Very little attention was paid to it until the Russian invasion of Crimea in 2014, when the term hybrid warfare entered the mainstream media lexicon. Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential campaign put to rest any doubts about the threat, and thankfully, The Canadian government, as we've heard from Arif, has fully acknowledged that our democracy has been and continues to be under attack and is taking measures to address vulnerabilities ahead of the fall federal elections. However, the threat is constantly evolving. There is no magic bullet, nor any single one-time solution that will address all vulnerabilities. The cost of engaging in social media-based information warfare for Vladimir Putin and other like-minded malign leaders is inexpensive and cheap. And the destructive yield of disinformation and digital disruption is high. For less than the price of a single T-14 Armada tank, Vladimir Putin has managed to tear the fabric of US democracy and society and is doing the same to societies throughout the Western world. Western democracy has been shaken to its core, and it requires active vigilance and persistent engagement to maintain its future stability. In this area, MLI has actively supported work to identify, expose, and counter Russian and other foreign disinformation aimed at undermining Canadian democracy, our alliances, and society. It is through events such as this one where we can learn from other experiences and initiatives to protect our democracy. Today, we'll hear from leading international experts who have been monitoring and thinking about how to defend our democracies and alliances against those who seek to undermine and subvert them. With us today are Alan Rock, who requires little in the way of introduction. He has served as Canada's Justice and Health Minister and was Canada's ambassador to the United Nations. Mr. Rock was the President and Vice Chancellor at University of Ottawa until 2016. Most recently, he serves as the Canadian Commissioner to the Transatlantic Commission to protect election integrity. As the name suggests, this international group has undertaken efforts to study and analyze attempts to disrupt and interfere with elections around the world. And Mr. Rock will be releasing a report, if I'm not mistaken, about Canada's election and election infrastructure shortly. Thank you, Alan, for participating and all the important work you're doing to protect Canada and our democracy and our elections. In addition to being a 2020 candidate for Congress in Texas's 23rd district, Liz Wall made international headlines in 2014 when she courageously quit Russia's RT, Russia Today, live on air. Her actions raised broad global awareness about the true nature of this Kremlin propaganda channel. Liz is a well-recognized expert on Russian disinformation. We're very, very lucky to have her with us today. Thank you, Liz. Jakub Janda is the head of the Kremlin Watch program and director of the European Values think tank based in Prague. He specializes in the response of democratic states to hostile disinformation and influence operations. He is an associate fellow at the Slovak Security Policy Institute and regular contributor for the Atlantic Council. He serves as a member of the editorial board of the expert portal antipropaganda.sk and is in the active reserves of the Czech Armed Forces. And I'm very honored to say that Jakub has co-authored a forthcoming report with me and Natalie Vogel with the help of Irfan Yar on Kremlin and other foreign disinformation threats against Canada and our upcoming elections. Now, I'll ask each of our panelists to make a 5-minute introductory remark about their work and on the threats of Russian disinformation. We'll have a discussion about those vulnerabilities and risks that Canada and our allies are exposed to, and perhaps some solutions on how we might address them, in addition to those already announced by the government. We'll then take questions from the audience. I'll ask Mr. Rock to give the first remarks.
Thank you, Marcus, and thank you, MDI, for hosting this very important event. Let me first say a few words about this commission that Marcus referred to. The commission was created last year to look at 20 democracies around the world who are having elections by the end of 2020, and to assess their readiness to identify and resist malign foreign interference. One of those countries, of course, is Canada. And my principal responsibility as a member of the Commission was to prepare an election readiness report for Canada, which will be published next Tuesday. We just heard from the Parliamentary Secretary that the Government of Canada has taken many important steps recently to try to reinforce our democracy. Now I have your attention. To try to reinforce our democracy. I don't need this. In any event, I want to say that overall, the Commission report will give Canada and our government high marks for what was done. It's not just an old Liberal speaking. The Commission is made up of Republicans and and Democrats and liberals and conservatives from across the world.
When we met here at the end of April, we heard from the Minister, Karina Gould. We looked at the substance of what Canada has done, and there was agreement across the table that Canada is really leading the world in the concrete, effective steps that have been taken over the last couple of years. We should be very proud of that. However, there's one area where we see that there's more to be done, and it's in the fourth category that Arif mentioned during his remarks: social media platforms. Let me begin by saying that despite the title of today's event, this is not just about Russia, and this is not just about elections. We as a generation are facing an unprecedented challenge in having to understand and responsibly manage this new and pervasive, remarkably powerful form of communication and social action. What's going on out there with platforms of social media poses real threats, not just to our democracy, but to our underlying social consensus. It's capable of being manipulated by people who mean us harm, not just for the next election, but for the social consensus in our country, the strength of our institutions, and the future of our democracy. So it's a major challenge. So how do you regulate social media? I've just got 2 minutes left, so it'll be easy for me to summarize it in 2 minutes. The fact is, there's no easy answer to that question. The government cannot be the arbiter of what's true. Government can't say, this is not true, so take it off Facebook. That's not the government's job. And indeed, ordering social media platforms to remove content is itself risky. What about due process, and what about freedom of expression? And who's to decide whether something is false or true? That's very shaded often. So what do you do? It seems to me the first thing you do is try to understand the technology and come to understand that social media platforms are not level. They're tilted. They're tilted in favor of extremist views, in favor of controversy, provocation, and pitting interest against interest. If you're Mark Zuckerberg and you've launched Facebook, your objective for your shareholders and yourself is to drive up the number of users. And when they're using it, to have them use it more and more. And how do you do that? By putting topics on Facebook that incite interest through controversy, and then pitting one extreme view against the other to raise the heat. The hot button issues, inflammatory content, attracting people to those sites, and once you've got them, recommend other sites that are equally provocative. So you end up with a false impression that these minority views, which are extreme, are far more popular than they actually are. And that's how you distort public opinion, misunderstanding spreads in the population, social cohesion is diminished, and the bad guys get what they're after. And by the way, so does Mr. Zuckerberg, because his usership's going up. So getting into the technology of the platforms, understanding how the algorithms are constructed, and being able to influence them to level the playing field is step number one. There's more than I can say. I'm taking up my time. Perhaps in the ensuing discussion, we'll have an opportunity to elaborate on that point. But I just want to say, this is a major challenge that we're facing, and it goes far beyond the election of 2019. Thank you.
Yes, we'll definitely discuss that later. It's number one on my list of questions, so we'll talk about that further. Liz.
Well, first of all, thank you to the Institute for hosting this very important and timely event. My name is Liz Wall. As Marcus had introduced me, I am a journalist, a speaker, and a media literacy activist. My involvement in this issue has been a personal journey. I was an anchor and correspondent for RT in Washington, D.C. Started in 2011, and over the course of about 2.5 years, I saw this station that touted itself as an alternative to the mainstream and giving a voice to the voiceless and those that feel disenfranchised or are not heard by the establishment media or are being overlooked by our institutions. And I saw that this mission, in a way, in fact, we did that. But it took a turn for the worse, I think, in 2014 during the crisis in Ukraine. And that's when I feel that Russia became very aggressive in its disinformation campaigns, not only through overt methods such as RT and Sputnik, where some people are able to recognize what it is that they're consuming. Some people are not. I mean, I would see some people during the campaign post Sputnik articles not noticing what it was that, the origin of what it was, because it conformed to their hyper-partisan beliefs. And it works in a hyper-partisan environment like the one that we had during the 2016 presidential election. I think what's been remarkable for me, having seen it from the inside, is to see what was once considered fringe views to become mainstream. One frequent guest, for example, that we had on was, oh my gosh, the name is escaping me, the head of Brexit.
Nigel Farage?
Nigel Farage, yeah.
Vladimir Putin?
No, he was never a guest.
Okay,
I don't know if he watched. It's a weird thing to think about. But yeah, for example, Nigel Farage was a frequent guest. I remember interviewing him. At the time, he was considered a fringe voice. He was a Eurosceptic, but he was somebody that was not given enough airtime by the mainstream media. Lord and behold, years later, he would become instrumental and a leading voice in the Brexit campaign. And we would have voices on like that were once fringe, that are now mainstream. And so I think that we need to take this seriously, because extremist voices, those that aim to undermine democratic values, democratic institutions, that are Eurosceptic, that are anti-NATO, that are anti-Western values, that are anti these alliances that have brought us together for all these years, are now being undermined. And it's resonating with a lot of people. We see that it's resonated in the United States. We see a disillusionment with the establishment, and therefore this kind of narrative that's spread on Russian television and then also disseminated online through bots, through trolls on social media, and picked up through fringe websites. And then all of a sudden you're seeing it on Fox News, and all of a sudden you're seeing it by politicians that are not fringe anymore. So hopefully the 2016 election has been a rude awakening. I had mentioned Ukraine as a turning point, and ever since then, there was the downing of the MH17 airliner. There was a lot of disinformation around that. The war in Syria, undermining the atrocities committed by Bashar al-Assad. And I think in the United States, we knew that this was happening, but we thought, you know what, that's happening in Ukraine. This has nothing to do with us. We are a strong democracy. This is not anything that would impact us, because we're a strong democracy. But we're learning very, I guess, in a very alarming way, that we are absolutely not immune in the United States. And we had an investigation that just wrapped up, the Mueller investigation, that showed that, it's still under debate to the extent to which, that's a whole nother thing to get into. And that itself was divisive and exploited by foreign actors that were trying to manipulate the divisiveness of just that investigation to try to get to the bottom of Russian interference into our election. So it has become so polarized in the United States, and I think the division in our country has been rife for exploitation by foreign adversaries, mainly Russia, because our intelligence agencies looked into this unanimously. 17 of our intelligence agencies had concluded that Russia interfered in our election to undermine the candidacy of one candidate, Hillary Clinton, and to amplify and boost and essentially help Donald Trump get elected. And so we have a foreign adversary that essentially used new technology through cyber hacking and disinformation to interfere in our elections and to further and to meddle in our democracy by exploiting existing grievances. So what are divisive issues that already existed in 2016 2016. Let's say gun rights, LGBT rights, women's rights, immigration, a huge one that was exploited during the 2016 campaign. And we're seeing this across the Atlantic with our allies throughout Europe, in France, in Germany, the attempt to boost far-right, once fringe, Marine Le Pen. And we're seeing, for example, the Yellow Jackets were boosted and continue to be. So I would just say that every issue, every grievance, everything that is already divisive in a Western democracy is fair game for exploitation by a foreign adversary, particularly during elections where they're trying to undermine democratic values, democratic institutions, and to try to weaken democracies because that strengthens Russia as a result. Just a couple of themes that I saw while I was there that have gained mainstream prominence since then. This anti-Western values, trying to undermine Western institutions, anti-NATO I had mentioned, anti-globalization, anti-establishment, so trying to undermine established politicians, moderate voices, and a strong anti-immigrant sentiment that we're now seeing that has really strengthened in the United States and in Europe as well. And something that we might have to look out for to a certain extent in Canada. I like to think our northern neighbors are more resilient than we are in the US. So we're seeing these international trends of nativism, of xenophobia, of protectionism, and right-wing populism, also on the left. So it's really amplifying voices on the far right and the far left, and silencing critics or those that try to speak out about this. I know after my viral moment that I was the target of Russian disinformation, and they really try to smear your character and your motivations and just who you are as a person to try to silence you. And I obviously have not been silenced because I'm running for Congress. So I will not be silenced. And I think as this goes on, I think my 5 minutes might be up, but we'll continue to talk about this, our vulnerabilities, how to build resilience, and how to come up with solutions in democracies.
Great, thank you, Liz. And from the European side, Jakub.
All right, thank you very much for having me here. I do come from Prague, and if you don't know where it is on the map, I actually want to give you a brief story. Last year, we celebrated the 20th anniversary when in 1998, we defeated Canada in ice hockey. It was the Olympic Games in Nagano, and it was the semifinals, and we won 2-1. So I just want to remind you where Prague is. But now more to the real stuff, let's say. So I've been talking to government insiders here, and also to Canada's, let's say, government officials who've been traveling across Europe, trying to find things which Canada should be doing to protect your elections here. And I have to say, you are like Sweden. Not in a case that just almost everybody likes you and Donald Trump doesn't like you, but more importantly, all the preparations which seems to me that the government has been doing here are actually very detailed. And that's something what hasn't been happening in many countries in Europe, because quite often it took time before the country got hit by Russian interference in their elections, and then they started to care. I mean, Spain and Catalonia crisis, for example. Netherlands and MH17 downing, for example, or the 2016 referendum in the Netherlands on the association agreement between EU and Ukraine. So once the Russian interfered first, then the country started to take it seriously and look into, well, first, what is it? What should we do about it? That was 2014 till 2017 and 18. Most of European countries, outside of the Baltic states and maybe Poland, Sweden, who've been very resilient. Most of us in Europe have been, I would say, very naive and very slow in understanding it. You do have, I would say, the luxury of time to some extent. So you had time to look into what has been happening in Europe. And to me, it seems that the Canadian government has done its homework on this. which I think is very positive. And for example, the protocol which you mentioned on the way how the reaction should be happening, I honestly haven't seen anybody else doing it in the Western world. And this is precisely something what I think should be done. That you take the decision on calling out for interference from the political class, give it to security professionals, and let them call it out, and give them a tool and a mandate to do so. That's something what I believe every country should do. So I think there are three areas where every country or every democratic country how they should protect their elections. First, build your own resilience and internal mechanisms. That's something what the Secretary mentioned, and that's something what I believe Canada is preparing for quite well. What I think actually is or could be done as well is that because elections are only one point on the timeline, but what the Russians and the Chinese and obviously others, but those two mainly do, they play two games at the same time. One is changing the playing field. So they are trying to change public opinion on specific policy matters. So in time, if you do this for 3-5 years, you actually can change public opinion. Specific example from Czech Republic. Around 1/3 of Czech population currently believes that Ukraine is run by a fascist government, which it is not. But we have had Russian proxies or political disinformation entities who've been saying this for 4 or 5 years. And already 1/3 of our population believes this. Why is it important? Because if you are a government minister in the Czech Republic, for example, how do you want to publicly support Ukraine? Say, look, Ukraine is under invasion from Russia. We need to support it. If 1/3 of your electorate, of your voters, believe they are fascist. So it limits your policy options. And at the end, it ends up that Ukraine is moving towards what Russia wants, being isolated from European partners, which we don't want to happen. So this is a long-term thing how Russia tries to do, and I would say China does it as well with slightly different means, but they are trying to do the similar thing. And then there are the short-term campaigns, so elections. So when there is a breaking point where Russia, but potentially China, want to change specific election result, they'll interfere, as they did in the US and many other European elections. So for that example, I think what every country should do, and not many are doing it yet, is, for example, regular polling. So you will do it annually, for example, to see what are the top 10 disinformation narratives which, for example, Russia tries to spread in your country. So, for example, I mean that Ukraine is run by a fascist government, or that some other policy views should be more pro-Russian, for example. If you measure this every year, you will see how is the long-term influence campaign successful in your country. Many European governments don't want to do this because it would expose that they actually do have a big problem in their own societies. So that's another thing which I know is politically sensitive, so maybe not the government doesn't have to do it, there are other actors who can do it, but it's a good thing to show or to see for yourself which topics actually are making strategic impact. So they are changing your beliefs as a society or groups within the society. The second area of response is something what, again, only the government can basically do. And we call it deter and punish aggressors. So basically, if I put it very simply, if a foreign actor, Russia or possibly China, interferes in your elections, one thing is to call it out. And for that, you seem to have a great mechanism. But then there needs to be a response to this. For example, when I discussed this with several French officials, they said, look, we did this in 2017, French presidential elections. We said publicly, if Russia interferes, we will strike back or we will punish it. So I asked, well, and did you, after Russia interfered in your elections? Well, said, well, we call it out publicly. Well, is it a punishment for Russia if somebody says it? Maybe to some extent, yes. But there are so many ways how democratic countries can and should punish such a behavior. And why is it important? Because if you do this, you might deter it from happening to others. And that's what we are not doing as a Western alliance. So that's why Russia and possibly currently China is doing it. When they pick us one by one, we don't punish them, meaning Russia or China. So for example, when Canada is now being basically politically blackmailed by China on these issues, I'm sad to say that European allies are not standing up for Canada. And similarly, the European allies did not do it for Sweden or Norway a couple of years ago when China did it to them. And because those actors, Russia or China, sees that, they know that if they pick us one by one on individual cases, they will not get punished. And this is what needs to change, I believe. So punishment of the aggressor is the second tool. And there are many diplomatic, personal sanctions which we should be putting out, and we are not actually. That's if you look, and it's great that you have the Magnitsky Act. And I mean, we don't have it in the Czech Republic. We are trying hard to get it. But the question is, how many entities are on that list? Are they Russian? Are they Chinese? From which countries do they come? And I know it's politically sensitive. But if you don't call out, for example, the Chinese activities, they will keep doing it because they will not get punished. And I'm finishing up with the third response area. And that's what I would call punish and deter proxies. So if I put it very simply, if Russia or China has their political, civil society, university proxies in those countries, for example, in my country, in the Czech Republic, what needs to be happening is that there needs to be somebody who calls them out, who makes it transparent where this funding comes from. How many Confucius Institutes do we have in our country? How many Russian organized groups do we have in our country to influence our activities domestically? This is what needs to be public, and it needs to be politically challenged within the legitimate political discussion. I'm not saying let's make it legal, no. I'm saying let's challenge it politically. But there, the government cannot do it much. That's really a matter of legitimate political discussion. For that, you need people who are specialists in this, like Marcus, like many of us here, but you need more of us, or more people who are actually willing to go out publicly and call it out. Because at the end, and that's my final point, the result between, the difference between whether you will defend yourself as a country or not is something what the soldiers call will to resist or will to fight. And in this field, in a non-military field, it is really about what do you allow to be acceptable or legitimate within your political system. So in my case, it's the members of parliament traveling to Crimea and being paid by Russian money saying Russia is great. That's bad, and that's what I, as a civil society actor, as a think tanker, want to make legitimate. So I'm calling them out publicly, for example. Similarly on China issues. This is something what the government cannot do and shouldn't do because that's the role of the civil society or the civil discussion. So you need more actors who are actually doing it. Not just research, but publicly challenging the actors. Because then if you move this political norm over what is politically acceptable within your mainstream political spectrum, you will actually defend yourself. And that's a difference between Lithuania and Hungary or Greece, for example, which are on both of the lines. I mean, one is good, one has a serious problem. So I'll hear.
Great, thank you, Jakob. And I'm going to pose a quick question. Maybe Arif, you could start off by answering it. We'll go to social media. 2 points. You both mentioned resilience. I think this is the key goal, is ensuring that our societies are resilient against these sorts of information attacks. That has to be the ultimate goal. And one of the questions, accountability. That is a big question, and it comes back to social media. We saw just last week, there was a video of Nancy Pelosi. It was slowed down, it was made to sound, I mean, this great technology was used. She sounded like she was completely drunk on some sort of on a talk show. This case was brought up in the Grand Committee that was meeting here in Canada. Arif mentioned the fact that Facebook, Twitter, and Google did not participate. Facebook, I think the Canadian, the vice president attended. And he was asked about it, and they refused to remove this video from their platforms. And this despite having just signed Canada's Declaration on Election Integrity Online, which says that they've committed to protecting against misrepresentation of politicians. So I think that the big question here is, how do we deal with social media? Do we trust social media to self-regulate, or do we need the government to step in? Do they need to start taking responsibility for their content? And maybe it's anonymity that needs to go there, but how do we tackle this? Because it looks like, you know, we've tried to negotiate and discuss this in good faith with these platforms, but they're not having any of it. Arif, what are your thoughts?
So I can sense the frustration in your voice, and I'll just simply echo it. There are a lot of conversations that have been had over the last few years with social media companies, and their receptiveness to governmental direction is very, very limited. And I'm being fairly polite and diplomatic because I'm trying to act as a parliamentarian, as I was kindly reminded to do. But what I will say to you is that we've come to the point where we've got, and I'm glad you mentioned it, Marcus, we've got a declaration that was announced in the House about 3 weeks ago. We've got 3 of the 4 major platforms signing on to it, but is the rubber actually hitting the road? So they're meant to eliminate misrepresentation of candidates. They're meant to eliminate bot accounts. They're meant to be more transparent. But we struggle with very basic things that for some platforms, and I'll name Facebook in particular, there's a way of complaining, but that button for complaining is buried after 6 pages of other stuff, and it's hard to find. So where does that leave us? It leaves us in a situation where we've said, and the minister said this, that the era of self-regulation is definitely coming to an end. And what I take some comfort in is that at least with C76, and I appreciate your words, Jakub, that with C76, what we've implemented is an ad registry, which applies to online platforms. And it is one of the only of its kind, if not the only of its kind on the planet, which means that now, at least thankfully, if you're seeing something on Facebook, they have to maintain it, because you know social media, sometimes stuff is up and then it's gone. They have to maintain it, they have to tell you who put it up, what their purpose was, and they have to keep it in a cache registry, a CACHE, a repository registry, where you can then access it and say, well, okay, I saw that, why did I see it, whom were they targeting, what did it say, I feel like I saw it in July, but it's now September, I want to make sure whether that was legit or not. Those are the things, the steps that we've taken. I sincerely feel, and I think the entire government feels, that we need to take more of those steps because people are not coming willingly to the table. And it's frustrating when in our declaration context, or even in the EU context, which you'll be very familiar with, Jakub, they, with great fanfare, announced this directive with the EU, and they're going to be accountable, and they have failed to meet month after month their own standard that they themselves established. So it's a frustrating regime, but it's tempered by the important role that they do play in getting the information out about elections, about platforms, about sharing that information that we want to be shared because we want to empower the citizens to cast informed ballots for all of the reasons that Alan Rock mentioned about those cherished values of freedom of expression, particularly expressive votes during the election.
Great, thanks, Arif. We'll come back this way, and I'll ask Alan for your thoughts on that.
I'm skeptical of self-regulation in a corporate commercial environment because the responsibility, the first and most important responsibility of the senior officers of those corporations, Facebook and Twitter and the others, is to maximize value for their shareholders. It's not to protect our democracy, the integrity of our elections, or the importance of our social values, to maximize shareholder value. So I do not look to those companies to regulate themselves in the public interest. It's not their job. It's the government's job. I think the government has a role here. I've already said I'm skeptical about the government deciding what's true and what's not. I don't think the government feels able to do that. But there are some things the government, I believe, can do. There's reference been made to some of the codes of conduct that the social media platforms have imposed upon themselves as their effort at self-regulation. Well, what about if they were made obligatory, that there was accountability for complying with their own rules and regulations, and there were consequences if they did not? I'm not talking about fines. You may have seen the media a few months ago. Facebook looked at a $5 billion fine, which was of little interest to them because they're so cash rich. It's hard to get their attention with a monetary fine. But what about if the senior officers were obligated to certify compliance in writing with personal responsibility, financially and in terms of jail terms, if they certified falsely or inaccurately? Now that would get their attention. There are other things I think the government can do. If there are known fakes, if everybody agrees that a certain post or an image is absolutely false, there ought to be an obligation to take it down. They're running the platform. And you know, when the controversy first arose about President Obama's birthplace, and the proof was put forward that he wasn't born in Kenya, he was born in the United States of America, they asked the social media platforms to take down information to the contrary, and they said, well, no, we're not getting to the debate as to where he was born, we're just the conduit. We just put out there what people want to put out without passing judgment about whether it's true or not. Well, that's not good enough, given the enormity of the consequences of the misinformation. So where there are impersonations of public figures, where there are so-called deep fakes that are videos that show me or somebody else saying things we would never say in real life, giving the impression to the viewer that the person had said such things, those I think can be regulated. And furthermore, I was talking earlier about the technical aspects of the platform, the algorithms. You know, they're designed so that if you are looking at a post that expresses an extreme view, then the platform will recommend other similar posts to you and drive you toward them. So you're now seeing a number of posts reinforcing this extreme view, giving the false impression it's more popular than it actually is. That can be prevented. The algorithm can be adjusted. Furthermore, the technology is such that malign actors can flood a post with false likes or approvals or retweets. So once again, the impression is falsely given that the opinion expressed in that post or that tweet is much more popular than it is. Those algorithms can be adjusted. That technology can be corrected. And obvious abuses can be stopped. But I come back to my major point, which is that in the overall, we have to recognize the potential of this technology for harm. Social education, so the citizenry is aware and sensitive to these threats, is looking at these things with a skeptical eye. Get rid of that microphone. I knew I eventually would. So that we're all aware of the fact we can be manipulated by these malign people, and we have our guard up. That's important too. And then being aware of the fact that no one country is going to solve this problem alone. We all have to have sort of a democratic or a free-thinking approach among countries that are concerned about their social cohesion and want to act together in developing best practices, in adopting common approaches, so that the bad actors can't pop up tomorrow in Estonia and the next day in the United States and the day after that in Ireland. It's like whack-a-mole. Let's have a concerted international effort. And the G7 rapid response mechanism is a good place to start, but it's only 7 countries. Let's build on that. And I think Canada is in a position, given what Arif and the government have achieved, to provide a leadership role in that, convening a global conference on truth in communication and bring the nations of the world together toward a sensible, lawful, and effective strategy, fully respecting freedom of expression, but also respecting our right to defend ourselves against people who would maliciously harm us.
I'd just like to add on the compliance point, with regards to that Nancy Pelosi video, the Washington Post actually asked Facebook why they weren't removing it, and Facebook replied, "We don't have a policy that stipulates that information you post on Facebook must be true." So that's Facebook's position. Liz, you've had a lot of experience with social media and the trolls. What do we do?
Oh, yeah. So as I had mentioned, after my viral moment, this was 2014, and I was attacked viciously by trolls. And now looking back, you can tell that a lot of it was automated, because you would get a deluge, hundreds and hundreds of hate tweets, and it's the same kind of narrative that they're trying to push, and it's particularly vicious among women. They use words that I'm not even going to repeat right now because they're very unsavory and not appropriate for this forum. And no, you can't trust the media platforms to regulate themselves for all the reasons that Alan Rock had just explained. I think it takes a lot of public pressure when they do take action. It's because it's been brought to their attention, and they're facing more scrutiny, and they are forced to take action because of public pressure and because of media reports. And essentially it makes them look bad, and they're like, okay, well, maybe it's time to take action. Beyond that, I think it is time to seriously look at how these media platforms should be regulated. And I think, and of course, freedom of speech is something that we value so highly, and we should continue to. But I think also this is something that is exploited. Russia and other foreign adversaries are aware of how strongly we do value freedom of speech. And so they think that they're going to get away with it because we're not going to do anything about it. And honestly, I think that's a cop-out. There's rules when it comes to broadcasting and when it comes to print journalism. And now more and more people are turning online to the digital world, to the digital realm to get their information and are impacted by that. So, for example, there was just an article in the New York Times about a gentleman that was radicalized just by going through the YouTube rabbit hole. And he was subject to these algorithms that you had mentioned, where he would watch one extremist alt-right, which is the far right. And he would, and then he came down and the algorithms would lead him from one extremist video to another extremist video to another, and before you know it, he was a full-blown neo-Nazi. He's since speaking out about it and has reversed course and is now speaking out about how YouTube led to his radicalization. YouTube had said that because they are under public pressure, that they're taking steps to put notices when things are state-sponsored. But Reuters actually just recently did a report where they identified several Russian-backed channels that were spreading disinformation, that were spreading conspiracy theories, that were spreading far-right content, and they did not take them down. It was only until Reuters said, hey, these videos are up, this does not adhere to your policy, that they then took action and had taken them down. So in a nutshell, no, you can't trust them to regulate themselves. And considering, looking at 2016 election in the United States, how instrumental it has become. We just had Robert Mueller, who conducted that investigation into Russian interference in our election. And one of his concluding remarks was that our election is under attack through these methods, through cyber espionage and through the stealing of information online, using that information to strategically disseminate it and to impact the narrative, the psychology, the story, and to use disinformation to also manipulate reality, to undermine the very notion of truth and fact, so we're not able to even come to a consensus of what is true. And also I think that there's certain things, yeah, we value freedom of speech, but there's just some things that don't deserve to be highlighted online, like outright false conspiracy theories. I did this one story about the tragic Sandy Hook shooting that happened in my hometown of Connecticut. And several of the families are getting harassed online by conspiracy theorists that think that the whole thing was fake and stage managed by people that are trying to enact common sense gun control legislation. And this one father that I spoke to said that he has been trying to contact Facebook and YouTube and trying to get these inflammatory videos taken down about his 6-year-old son that was murdered. And they did nothing. They said, no, we're not arbiters of truth. And I think that that's just not a valid, I'd call them, I said, what are you gonna do about these videos? What are you gonna do about these Facebook groups where thousands of people subscribe and are mocking this poor father that's been harassed relentlessly online, and they're saying we can't do anything about it. We're not arbiters of truth. I mean, I think that can only be used to a certain extent. I mean, to a certain point, we have to say people are being victimized, people are being harassed, hate speech is being amplified, and there are limits to freedom of speech.
Thanks, Liz. Jakub, there are several European nations that have actually taken measures and have put in place regulations. What have you been seeing, and are they successful?
Yeah. Well, there is a huge frustration with Facebook among many European governments and the European Commission. So I think there is the feeling that self-regulation doesn't work is very well, it's a consensus basically among the political leadership. I think it's important to remember that the tech platforms are not the enemy and they are not the source, but they are the ones who are complicit in spreading it. And therefore there are many, I think, very relevant policy goals we should be targeting. And I'll name 6 of those which I see that some of the European governments are pursuing and actually do make sense. But I just want to warn out publicly that when we are discussing this, Facebook only allows this, which means allows the spread of disinformation, which means that we need to push it very hard, but not to confuse it with the source of it, which quite often is Russia or domestic extremists. Because sometimes in the political debate, for many European political debates, it's much easier to say it's Facebook responsible for disinformation. Well, it's responsible for spreading it, and we should basically punish and push it to change it. But there are the sources. We are essentially quite often hostile countries and their proxies and domestic extremists. So just don't confuse this. So 6 specific, let's say, policy goals I believe any democratic government can have. Number 1, I believe it should be our interest jointly to actually push the tech platforms like Facebook so that they would consider or declare that it is in their interest to support professional journalism, because they are basically now saying, we don't care what kind of information is out there, whether it's some fringe conspiracy outlet or whether it's some respected mainstream media. And there is a big difference between that. And there are many ways how to measure it. So what I think should be changing slightly, and we could discuss how to do it. It's not easy. We can't just force it by legislation. But we need to change the mindset of companies like Facebook, so they would say, we are supporting good journalism. That's our objective as a company. Not that we are competing with it, because that's something what many legitimate journalists are honestly afraid of, that Facebook will not replace them, but will take away many of their income, which will be a strategic problem for us as society. So I believe this should be number 1 goal. Number 2, protection of personal data. I believe one of the few things Europe has done well is the GDPR, which is a legislation or regulation in Europe which basically forces companies to take very seriously protection of personal data. It's very hard for some companies, but that's something what I think could be essentially one of the few regulation role models in protecting personal data. A lot of it came up from the Cambridge Analytica scandal, so I think that's a good reaction, more or less. We'll see how it works out. We still haven't seen any major fines put on specific companies in Europe, just very minor ones so far. But I think the regulatory framework is very good. Basically, we are allowed to protect our own data, and the governments or the EU is doing it. Number 3, it should be a policy or an option for a user not to see fake accounts. And it is more for Twitter than on Facebook. So if I'm on Twitter today, I should have a button which I press, and it will hide all the non-personal or, let's say, fake automated accounts. Well, it is not in the business interest of Twitter today, because they need to have hundreds, or they need to have more users than real persons are using it, and because it's a business interest. But it is not a societal interest, I believe. So I'm not saying they need to ban it for legal reasons, but I'm trying to say that we should, every user should have an option not, let's say, not to see or hide all the non-legitimate, non-real accounts. Number 4, what the EU has done is that it has forced Facebook and the platforms in general to publish monthly reports. So basically how they are doing in these fields. It's highly insufficient at this moment. What the platforms are declaring is not true every time, let's say, and it is not enough. But it is a good tool to do because they need to be held accountable, and they need to make it public so that the public or the governments and the legislation bodies can actually look into the specifics and say, so what have you done this month in this country or in this language space? Let's look into it. How seriously do you take it? And then discuss the specifics. For example, something what in the US is called the honest ads, or the basically transparency of advertisement, which you mentioned. That's specifically what I think should be a must for every country or every regulation we have. Number 5, I'm getting to the end. I believe it should be in the interest of the tech platforms to support media literacy programs. And the logic is very simple. They have basically an innovation tool in their hands, they can make it very disturbing for people who are not so media literate, let's say, at least in our countries. So it should be in their interest as CSR, as a social responsibility, to put some part of the income they get, of the money they get, into media or digital literacy programs. They are not doing it in most of the countries, and they should, I believe. And that's, again, it's their decision. They are private businesses, but I believe this is something how they could legitimately actually make sure that we all really see that they mean it seriously. Number 6, and that's the end, I believe the tech platforms should be basically forced by regulation to have national offices which are responsible for national cases. Maybe you don't feel it here that much in Canada when you use it in English or French, but believe me, in smaller nations where primary language isn't English or French, for example, it's pretty hard. When you have a market of 10 or 15 million, so Czech Republic, Slovakia together, for example, so Facebook doesn't really care about you. You are such a small market for them to care. So if there is a case of disinformation or any incident related on Facebook, and you try to reach out to them as individuals or groups, basically you will not get anywhere because you don't have a specific place to go as a national office for the company. And quite often those platforms don't even have language experts for your language. And for example, Czech, Slovak, Polish, Hungarian, for example. So this is something what they should be forced to. So for example, when you are trying to invite somebody specific from Facebook, you would welcome a country manager for Facebook, for example, for Canada or Latvia, for example. So that's a thing which we could force them with regulation to do, I think.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jakub. Now, can we pose one more question, Arif? I know your time is short. Or do you have to run?
I've probably got to go. I apologize. So
okay, not a problem.
So I just want to say thank you for having me. It's been terrific. What I want to just add to the conversation is that I think where we've gotten to, just jumping on what you'd mentioned about Sandy Hook, is that with what happened at Christchurch in New Zealand, you had a similar massacre to Sandy Hook then live streamed on these platforms. And it took it just to a level that I think the entire world was just aghast with. And finally, you're seeing some shaming taking place, where platforms are finally realizing that the line has clearly been drawn in the sand. I think there's some responsibility of individual users who are saying, I'm going to turn off Facebook. And the last piece that I would add is just for your conversation is that you may touch on the German example. Because when we talked about the online hatred, that B'nai B'rith was there at the Justice Committee, we talked about online hatred and social media accountability as part of this broader conversation. We looked at, in Germany, because of their legacy of neo-Nazis, they have such robust rules in place and such significant fines that Facebook apparently employs by thousands of fold the number of employees that monitor content in that country as compared to what they do here. So much so that if you take the same neo-Nazi site and put it in Kitchener, Ontario, and transport it to Munich, all of a sudden the content disappears instantly. So Facebook can take action, but we have to regulate it. But I apologize I can't stay. As Alan knows, I've got to get to question period because otherwise I'll be in trouble with the person called the whip. So thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure, and thank you for your expertise in all of the work you're doing. And good luck in 2020. It's very, very important. But thank you, Jakub. Thank you, Marcus.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Again, thanks, Arif. So I guess the next question I'd have is is there any way of hitting back? In Canada, we have a new piece of legislation, C-59, which would actually allow our government to take active defensive cyber measures. So we know that in multiple elections, especially the US, hacking was a major problem. And this hacking was done by a Russian military hacking unit called Fancy Bear. And they used what's called phishing tactics. So these are emails that are sent out. They spoof, say, Gmail or Yahoo, asking you to reset your password for your email. And it looks like an authentic Gmail or Yahoo email, and you click on the link, and it asks you to put in your password. And what happens is that the hackers then capture your password and are able to access your emails, read all your emails, and potentially hack into all sorts of other accounts that you might have. Now, our legislation, C-59, would allow the government to take measures to attack and hit back actively against these sorts of hackers. The way that I read the legislation, it would also allow us to actively hit back in disinformation campaigns. Is this something that we need? Is this something that we want to do? Alan, as a former justice minister?
Well, I think one has to distinguish between crime on the one hand and an international offense on the other. In terms of crime, I mean, there are crooks out there who will send you phishing emails. They'll want your password, they'll want access to your accounts, either because they're going to install malware and blackmail you to get it off, or they're going to steal your money or impersonate you through character theft. So that's on the one hand crime. It's dealt with in the Criminal Code of Canada. We have tools to deal with that. They will be prosecuted and punished in our criminal courts. But distinct from that, there's a question of international cyber attacks. What happened in Estonia, for example, in 2007, when Estonia's entire infrastructure was taken over and shut down by a foreign attack. And that crippled the country, crippled an economy, brought it to a standstill with huge cost and effect. Now, two questions there. First of all, does that constitute an armed attack within the meaning of that term in international law, so that Estonia is entitled to retaliate in self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter? That's a separate question. An interesting one, and one that I discuss with students in my international humanitarian law class. It's very interesting. But it's an important question, because if we're getting to the stage where countries are going to attack each other, shut down or damage their infrastructure, their ability to run hospitals, or cripple their communication system internally, then you're talking about a serious attack, which might have to be dealt with in self-defense. There are areas in the middle where you have foreign interests, foreign states, who are interfering maliciously, not for personal gain, but not to the extent of, the Estonia example. And there, I would be reluctant to see Canada retaliate by doing the same in that country. This might be a situation where, that global meeting I talked about, where you bring all the countries together around a table to say, what are we going to do to defend ourselves? This might be a situation where if you had that kind of international consensus, then the nations of the world could turn on the country that did that, whether it was Iran or Russia or China, and disable them or do something to them collectively that would make them pay a price that would be prohibitive and constitute a real deterrent. So I think we have to feel our way along, try to remain true to basic principles as we develop responses to the problems that you're talking about, Marcus. I don't know that we want sort of a retaliation country by country that produces chaos, but I think distinguishing between cases, finding out when the criminal law is enough and then when international action is warranted, and then developing a way of acting internationally where you're bringing countries together, you have a solid collective response. I think that's the most effective way of dealing with it.
Great, thanks, Alan. Liz, any thoughts?
I think one thought, just using the U.S. as an example, is, we just had that Mueller investigation, and the Russian nationals that were responsible for the attack were identified, I believe named, and there's been sanctions placed against them. Indicted, yes, they've been indicted. So there's been action taken, and so the perpetrators have been identified and have been punished to a certain extent. I don't think it's enough to deter Russia from doing the same thing in 2020. I think they'll continue to do it, but it's important to, I think that was instrumental in that Mueller report, to call them out, to say the GRU is responsible, these are the people behind it, these are the people that are responsible, and we're going to place sanctions against you. Because at first I think it was just so abstract that it was hard to identify the threat, but when you call out the Internet Research Agency, the troll farm, when you call out the GRU and these individuals for actually participating in the cyber hacking and the disinformation, that's important. One thing that was really interesting in the American example was during the stealing and the subsequent dissemination of information by WikiLeaks was kind of like the intermediary, that our media was essentially complicit and had reported basically the information that Russia stole, or excuse me, that Russia stole, gave to WikiLeaks, was then on the front page of the New York Times, of the Washington Post. It was just so juicy that we couldn't help ourselves. So essentially, our media was instrumental in publishing in this disinformation attack that was on our democracy. So I think it's important to learn from that mistake, that when a hostile foreign power steals information and tries to weaponize information, that perhaps we should have some kind of journalistic code of conduct. I'm not sure this is possible in the United States. In an ideal world, where we say, no, this is not in the interest of, this is a hostile foreign power trying to manipulate the narrative, and we're not going to publish this.
I believe there are two measures. One is punish the aggressor, and by that I mean there are cyber intelligence means how to do it. But for example, the response could be cross-domain, meaning they attack us in the cyberspace, and we will not attack them back in the cyberspace, but we will do something else. So, for example, we have a list of fortune, of money of Vladimir Putin in the West. We have a list of people who actually are working for him, who are his close advisors, close oligarchs, and their families in the West. We have all of this knowledge is available, to our intelligence communities. So what we could do is that we can tell them in advance, if you interfere, all of this or part of it will be made public, and your citizen will see it. That's step one. Or step two would be, if you do this, your daughter will not be studying in London. She will just go away back to Russia because she will lose her visa. And there are legitimate and legal ways how to do it, for example. But we still haven't decided to do so as as Western democracies. So that's against the aggressor. Raise the cost for the aggressor, so it changes their calculus. So they will think, well, maybe I won't interfere because it would hurt me that bad, personally, as my shareholders or stakeholders, let's say, my oligarchs. The second thing is to deny the adversary their proxies, meaning let's raise the cost for the proxies for doing it. That's, for example, what the US intelligence community did prior to the 2018 elections, was that, at least according to public information, they have identified the proxies, so the hackers and people actually doing it for Russian intelligence, and they reach out to them and said, we know who you are, we know what are you doing. If you continue, we will expose you, we will possibly jail you if we can, and you will probably never enter the United States. And we know where your fortune is, by the way. Some of them, I don't know the details, but some of them actually back down because it's not nice for them to know that the Americans know who they are. So even within the hacking community, if we change their political cost or personal costs, meaning that Russia will not have easy time hiring proxies, be it hackers, be it political proxies, be it others. So they will have much tougher time using those people against us as contractors if we, as democracies, actually raise the cost for them. And there are relatively easy ways how to do it. And I think it's very legitimate for democratic countries to do so, because we are not killing them. We are not harming them personally. We are just making it transparent or denying them lovely things like entrance to Canada, United States, or their visas and their fortune here. I think it's legitimate to do so.
Right, and it's raising the cost of doing this. That's what we need to do. There has to be a cost, because right now it is so inexpensive to conduct this sort of information warfare for Russia and other nations. So imposing that cost, that's absolutely, I think, what we need to do. Now, we're going to open it up to the floor. The wireless mic, from what I understand, isn't working, so I'd ask for you to... Speak as loudly as possible, and I'll try to repeat your question, but maybe we'll take 3 questions at a time. How are we for time, Brian? 15 minutes? So let's just take 3 questions right off the bat. The gentleman over there and over here, and Ambassador Look. Okay, we'll start with you over there.
So when we
If you don't mind standing up and saying your name and
I'm
your
Ilya Mikityn, I'm from the Ukraine-Canadian Congress. My question is that we've been talking very generally about the kind of objectives that Russia and China, to a lesser extent, want to see in our happen in our elections. But when it comes to the United States or to Europe, there seem to be very clear objectives that they have, whether it's supporting a certain politician or pushing a given kind of narrative, for example, Brexit or just general skepticism. What are those in the Canadian context? Because we haven't really heard of anything, any politicians or any policy objectives that would seriously destabilize Canada relative to the Atlantic Alliance or relative to a rules-based global order.
So the question was, what are the ultimate motivations? What are the targets of foreign disinformation? The gentleman in the next row.
Yes, my name is Martin Rice. I'm just wondering if we can go a little bit further on this matter of getting more countries to work together in this. Now, I don't know if we're approaching something as, I guess, as dramatic as what led to NATO, but I guess my feeling is we're lacking the number one country ready to jump in here. Perhaps the United States is partly thinking of their own companies, like Facebook and so on. But I do look at the EU example of the privacy becoming almost a de facto standard that many non-EU companies have had to adhere to, or else they lose that business. Now, are we in similar circumstances where we can get to that level to see more countries to see it in their self-interest, including the big parties, to join together?
Okay, great, thanks. Ambassador Look.
Thank you. Thank you for this privileged approach. So I'm also Estonian, so Estonian to Estonian. A couple of comments. First of all, response. I think we need to really raise the price, of course, for cyber attacks and those disinformation. The question is how. Today we speak about whether or not UN Charter Article 59 is applicable, or maybe NATO Article 5 bis cyber is applicable also in terms of cyber attacks, because it goes unpunishable way, so no cost at all. So, how to respond, I don't know, but what Estonian did, just a short comment, that we opened up data embassy in Luxembourg. So, and this is a place we preserve the data, and it works on the Vienna Convention for also. But my question will be very simple, but I need to explain it this way. We want to bring in, the question would be, what's the future of social platforms? But my argument would be, the future is more delicate, bringing in a concept of national security. Canada was imposed on the pretext of national security those taxes and tariffs on something different. But the other day I think I read a news that Russian platform, Yandex, was forced to provide security forces with a cricket key. So what we do in that case? One is kind of dissemination media, but as I said, Alan, that the social platforms are dangerous things, and they haven't talked from perspective of national security interest. Do you have any response?
Just quickly, we have the question about the objectives of foreign disinformation, international leadership, and buy-in from corporations in order to take leadership to secure social media platforms, and the future of social media. Is it something that we could declare as a strategic asset and protect in that way? So please, we'll start with Alan and answer all or any as you wish.
I'd like to start with what the objectives are in Canada. It's a good question. I think the objectives of Russia and others in Canada, other state actors in Canada, is simply to sow discord, to reduce social cohesion, to create friction in the society, to disrupt our democracy, cause chaos, and do us harm in that way. I don't think they favor one party over the other in the coming election. There's no evidence that they do, and I'm really impressed at the nonpartisan, across the House effort being made by parliamentarians on this issue. This morning I was at a round table on this issue with Bob Zimmer, a Conservative member of Parliament from Northern British Columbia, saying exactly the same things as we heard from the Parliamentary Secretary from the Liberal Party. I know the NDP and the Greens are also concerned. As Bob Zimmer said this morning, we just want a fair fight. we just want a fair fight in the election. Don't interfere with it. Well, the Russians and others don't want to see a fair fight. They want to see damage done to the Canadian democracy. So I think that's enough for them if they can weaken us. The second question, can we get a number of countries together? I think we can. I think we can appeal to the common interest among countries that are all vulnerable to this kind of nonsense, this kind of harmful interference, and appeal to that common self-interest in pulling together a coalition that will work together to develop collective responses that will be effective. And that may be connected with the third question, which is, why isn't this seen as a subject of national security? Ambassador, you were kind enough to receive me in your office and with your team to tell me the amazing things that your country's done using technology and digital innovation to deliver government services and to have a voting system. It's amazing. You lead the world in all of that, in large part because of your experience in 2007 when you realized how vulnerable you could be if these systems were not safeguarded. Well, we should be learning more from you about that. And this collective of countries I spoke of should look into your case as an example of best practices. And yes, it is a matter of national security. And I think Canada regards it that way. The Minister of Public Safety is very much a member of the team, Minister of Foreign Affairs as well. G7 looks at this as a matter of national security. So developing common responses, getting as many countries as possible involved in this collective effort, and then finding ways to make those who are interfering with us pay a price, as Marcus and Jakob were saying. And you remember sanctions were imposed on Russia arising from their interference in the 2016 election. There's something odd going on in the White House in America now. The president seems to be
a lot of odd stuff going on.
very sympathetic to the Russians, and for reasons that we'll, I guess, eventually find out. But he's not advancing that. Maybe after 2020, we'll restore a more sensible setting in which we can see these issues play out in America. But there's got to be a price to pay through sanctions or otherwise when we see this interference, and how much greater and more effective that price would be if it was imposed not by one or two countries, but by a large group acting together.
Well, thanks, Alan. We do have that legislation. We have sanctions that we can apply in this case.
Yep.
So, Liz.
Yeah, in your regards to the impact on Canada, I think it's a wonderful thing, as Alan Rock had mentioned, that there's a bipartisan, all parties are concerned about this. And the United States, this has become a highly partisan issue with the GOP, a lot of it, not all of it, but largely they've taken, because the GOP has now become more of a Trumpist party, that this is overlooked, unfortunately. That's just the reality of the political climate in the United States today. So unfortunately, we're not seeing the unity on this topic to fight it as Americans. It seems like as Canadians, you're coming together and saying this is a threat. We saw that it happened to our allies in Europe and to our neighbors down south, and this is something that we are going to come together as Canadians to combat and address. As far as specific targets, I think you were asking about specifics. Just looking at what the common themes are and the common attacks. Canada, for example, is part of NATO. So, and we know that Canada has been dedicated in the Baltics, for example, and part of that mission in trying to deter Russia in that part of Eastern Europe. So, and also Canada, being a liberal democracy, tries to advocate human rights across the globe. These are all things that Russia does not like. So I know that there's been an attack on a Russia disinformation campaign on your foreign minister, Freeland, because of her stances on these issues, and they were saying that her grandfather was a neo-Nazi. And so you have to look out for voices that are taking a strong stance on this, and I think those are the voices that you're going to see will be targets of Russian disinformation, because those are the voices that they're going to want to attack and delegitimize. And also pay attention to issues that are divisive. What is it that is already divisive in Canadian socially, politically? All these things that already are sources of of division, because those are what will likely be exploited in the digital realm.
We don't have those in Canada.
No, not utopia here. I got to work on getting my passport.
Take us out.
Oh, good. I might have to.
I should just quickly add that former Estonian President Toomas Hendrik Ilves, who Alan Rock works with on the commission, has also said quite publicly that Canada is doing amazing work in this regard. But he's also said that we should go beyond the G7, that this is a much broader issue, and Canada really could take leadership in pulling it into that much bigger sort of arena for a broader discussion. Jakub, your thoughts?
I think there are two strategic interests which Russia would have, or let's say imagine an ideal scenario for Russia, what they would like Canada to do. And I'm not saying they are close. It looks like they're not. But they would love to Canada, let's say, to be more isolated, or let's say look more inwards. And more practically, Russia doesn't, as you mentioned, Russia doesn't want Canadian troops in, I believe, in Latvia, I believe, there is a framework nation of where Canada is leading it. So that's what Russia would like to be taken away. And how you can do it? By various political activities inside Canada, if you can achieve it as Russia. Similarly, Canada does a lot of, I would say, very good things in Ukraine, in support of Ukraine democracy. Clearly, that's not what Russia wants. So again, that's another thing. And in a case of Article 5 situation, what Russia would like to have is countries like Canada within the alliance, which would be, let's say, more, not so quick in understanding what the Russian aggression is, possibly in the Baltics, if it happens. So this is clearly what Russia would like to have from Canada. And the second thing, which is, if you read the archives of the KGB, basically nothing really changes for today's Russian security apparatus. So for them, number one enemy is the United States. So the ideal scenario for Russia is when there are many, let's say, disruptions or possible negativities in relations between Canada and the US. And obviously, it's not only Russia pushing for this. Unfortunately, there are, let's say, I would say, natural issues which are sadly happening between US and Canada. But this is clearly what Russia would like to support, those disruptions between US and Canada if they arise in the future, because any wedge between the United States and its allies is a Russian win. So clearly, this is where I would assume they would be trying to get, but it doesn't seem to me that they are very close to there, actually. Number two, how could we actually do it more internationally or more in a community of nations? I believe, and it really is a Canadian decision, but I believe Canada is in a great position to actually lead a coalition or a community of nations which will be looking more into raising the costs for Russia, but also for China. And specifically on the China question, given your experience you have in the current case of Chinese political blackmail or intimidation of Canada, I think I could clearly see the lack of solidarity among, let's say, Western democracies. One of us is being picked, mainly by Russia or China, on individual issues. The others don't stand up. They do symbolically, but not practically. There are no sanctions against individual countries like Russia or China on this, or there are no boycotts of political or diplomatic nature. So, for example, what is going on from China to Canada right now, I believe what should be happening is that, for example, European nations, all of us should withdraw our ambassadors from Beijing, just for a couple of weeks, to make sure Beijing understands we are in this together. And it honestly doesn't cost anything. So this is a very simple thing to do. We are not even doing at this moment. So where I would see, ideally, Canada doing it, because you have a great position of being likable in Europe, unlike the current US administration among many European governments. And you are in an objective position where you are being harassed by China, for example. So if Canada would be reaching out to European allies saying, now it's us, but next time it will be again you, like it happened to Norway or Sweden in the past, let's do it together next time. Let's do it much better. Let's coordinate our effort and really raise the political cost for the ones who are the aggressors. And the very last point, on the national security and the tech platforms. Well, Yandex basically works for the FSB. That's public information. That's the reason why Ukraine, for example, banned Yandex and VK as well. And I think what is basically happening now from the American perspective is the effort for decoupling. So basically, more or less, if I put it very simply, Chinese technologies will more or less try to stay in China or Chinese proximity, and our technologies, meaning including Facebook, Twitter, and others, we are trying to keep for ourselves, more or less. I don't know if it's ideal, but that's how it's going to move on, I'm afraid. So for that reason, it's in our interest to force the tech companies to become responsible, because otherwise they will be liabilities as they are for our societies at this moment. So that's another important step why we really need to push them.
Great, thanks, Jakob. And time check, I think we need to wrap up. Okay, so thank you. My thanks to all of you. And I'd like to call up Brian to say a few closing remarks.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Jakob for reminding us where that hockey team came from that got lucky once. But once doesn't really cut it. It's always good to remember the time you win. Ladies and gentlemen, let me ask you to thank both the panelists and Marcus for doing such a terrific job for you and for the Institute in illuminating not only the issues that we face, but the potential solutions that are available to us. I have learned a tremendous amount for this, and I'd ask you to join me in. Really appreciate it. Those of you who've not been to our events before will find what I'm about to say a bit mysterious, but bear with me. My tie today celebrates Shakespeare. And many of you who are regular attendees at our events will often ask me what the story is of how my tie relates to the day's event. And of course, Shakespeare is relevant to today's event because of George Orwell's 1984, a novel in which an evil regime has taken control of society in part by seizing all the means of communication and using them to fill people's minds not just with propaganda, but removing people's freedom of thought by politicizing language so that words come to mean the opposite of their true meaning. And the hero of the novel, Winston, has a recurring dream about being in a golden country, complete with elms and a meandering footpath and a pasture and a stream and willow trees. It's a rural idyll. And a dark-haired woman is part of this dream, and in this particular version of the dream, she tears her clothes off with a disdainful gesture. And Winston, he doesn't have a sexual response to this, but he appreciates her casual defiance of authority. She's defying the people who tell her what to do. And as Orwell wrote in the novel, what overwhelmed Winston in that instant was admiration for the gesture with which she had thrown her clothes aside. With its grace and carelessness, it seemed to annihilate a whole culture, a whole system of thought, as though Big Brother and the party and the thought police could all be swept into nothingness by a simple, splendid movement of the arm. That, too, was a gesture belonging to the ancient time, and Winston woke up with the word Shakespeare on his lips. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for attending our event in the context of malign foreign actors seeking to undermine our confidence in our own institutions and beliefs through the casual insertion of manipulative untruths into our democratic procedures. We must all, every one of us, awake every day with the word Shakespeare on our lips. Yeah. And recommit ourselves constantly to defending the integrity of the free way of life and thought, which Shakespeare both embodies and exemplifies. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been a Macdonald-Laurier Institute event. We are Ottawa's leading independent and nonpartisan public policy think tank, winner of the Sir Anthony Fisher Prize for top think tank book in the world, of the Templeton Award for Outstanding Think Tank Achievement, and the Prospect Magazine's Award for Top Social Policy Think Tank in North America. We welcome your presence at our events and the support that many of you give to our work. Thank you for coming today, and we hope to see you again soon at another MLI event, which will also be brilliantly organized by my colleagues, Allison and Amber and David and Irfan and Uswa and many other people who have gone to a great deal of trouble so that you would be able to enjoy this event. And I would ask you in conclusion to applaud them with me.